Hi, my name is Dr. Elizabeth Sullivan, and I'm the Assistant Professor of Oboe and Musicianship here at UNC Charlotte. Today, I'm going to be walking you through the 2018-2019 All-District Solo Material for Oboe. This year's solo is written by Mozart, and it's actually the quartet for oboe, violin, viola, and cello. There's a few things that applies to both the first and second movement. First, during the classical period, we would have been instructed to take no rubato, so be sure that you're practicing with your metronome and sticking to strict time. Second, there's some interesting ornaments that we need to tackle in each of the movements. Let's start with the first movement. A good recommended metronome marking for the first movement would be quarter note equals 108 to maybe 120. That's a good range to choose from. Be sure that you can play every measure in a very steady fashion, so don't worry about going too fast. Just do your best to play accurate. That's the most important thing. The very first ornaments that we come across in the first full measure and the first full second measure, these are ornaments with a slash through the grace note. In Mozart's time, he used that to communicate to play those grace notes quickly, rather than making them a full 16th note beat. We encountered the slow grace note later in this movement in measures 25 and 26. So let's take a look at those differences between the slash marks and then the grace notes with no slash marks. So the difference should sound like this. Those are quick and condensed, and then later on, the grace notes without a slash mark through them become full 16th notes. So you'll play those measures as straight 4/16ths in a row, not as a grace note. The other ornamentation that we run into a little bit later is the group of 4/16th notes, then quickly followed by an 8th note and 2 sets of triplets. You're going to work on these grace notes by playing them directly on the second beat. Do your best to squeeze those 4 grace notes into the first half of beat 2 so that you can play the 8th note on the and of 2 as it's written in both of these measures. A good way to practice that is to take out the ornament altogether and just play the basic dotted quarter and 8th note followed by the triplets. That way you get the basic rhythm built in, very steady, and then you can add your ornaments in after that. So let's talk a little bit about the articulations that we're asked to perform here in this fast movement. You'll notice in your part there are a lot of staccato markings, but these staccato markings are not like what you would play in a Sousa march in the large ensemble. In Mozart's time, these would have been bouncy staccato markings, indicating that we should play the notes separated but not dry. So a good example for practice would be here at the very beginning, the first full phrase. You have staccato marks over 8th notes followed by an 8th rest, and then the 8th notes that appear in a row. In some editions, depending on what edition you're playing from, there might even be staccato markings over the quarter notes that appear at the end of measure 3. You want to be sure that you're not playing them dry and short. Have a little bit of vibrato even in your sound when you're performing these. They should have some life to them and they should resonate quite a bit. One of the other things that I want to mention is the long string of 16th notes that you've probably been worrying about here before measure 36. You'll get another string of them in short bursts before 20 and at 53. A good way to practice this is actually more than half the tempo and actually get your 8th note on with the metronome and practice these very slowly. The way that they appear in measures 33 and 34 almost wants to trap you into playing them in groups of 2. Yada, 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 yada. It's all slurred, so hopefully you're not adding any extra articulations, but the groups of 2 can be rather tricky. So if we practice them very slowly, we can get out any sort of hesitations or bumps in the sound. something maybe as slow as this. That slow, once you can do the whole 16th note passage that smoothly at that tempo, it'll be very easy to speed it up to your goal tempo after that. One last note, the final ornamentations that appear before measure 64. You have 16ths and 32nds with a trill mixed in. You'll have another pattern similar to this after measure 20, where you have a trill in the midst of 16th notes. The important thing to remember is that you don't have to wiggle that trill for a very long period of time. You actually just need to get in about 2 wiggles with your finger, and then you can move on to the rest of the notes. Oftentimes we think that we need to trill for much longer than that, and really a trill is just 2 or more wiggles. Lastly, these ornamentation groups happen on the and of the beat. So make sure that you're not trying to put them with your metronome downbeat. So dum, yada-da-dum, 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 bum, ba-dum, just like that. Hopefully that will help you practice your first movement of the Mozart Oboe Quartet and feel really successful for this part of the audition. What you'll find if you listen to any recordings is that the slow movement is very slow. You should get your metronome on actually counting the 8th note, and your 8th note pulse is going to be anywhere between 60 to maybe 66. Hopefully, counting the 8th note, these 32nd note passages will suddenly feel a lot easier because they're not that fast. Utilizing your 8th note as the pulse, your 32nd notes become just like 16ths, and your 16ths will become just like 8ths. The 16th triplets that appear in playing measure 6 become like 8th note triplets. So if we get our 8th note count on, ya da 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 da, triplet, triplet, 1, ya da dum, just like that. Much, much easier to deal with than if we were counting the quarter note pulse. This is a very slow movement, so breathing is going to be quite tricky. Even though you don't want to play that long note for forever, it really is quite a long note to start with. Get your brain thinking about the 8th note pulse before you begin. Breathe in time and be sure that you're counting all of the 8th notes through that very long held over dotted half to a dotted half to a quarter. Take a quick breath and then you're in with the 32nd notes. Now I've marked in my part several places to breathe after this. I'm going to breathe between the C sharp octave jumps, the E flat octave jumps, and if you really needed to, in measure 10, you could breathe after the D on beat 1 before you move to the A flat. Sometimes it's nice to have extra places to breathe. Even if in practice time you don't use them, when you get nervous in the audition or playing for someone else, you might need the extra places to breathe. Now, if we follow along, we move to 16th, dotted 16th and 32nd note passages. Ya-da-dum, bum, ya-dee. And these become like our very old favorite dotted 8th and 16th patterns. So again, it's just the idea of that rhythm transfer when we're counting the 8th note as our pulse. The other tricky place when we come down to our rhythm is down here in the 3rd line where we have 32nd note triplets followed by straight 16ths. Now you might be a little nervous about the triplet 32nds, but the real challenge is to make sure that when we go from the triplet passage that we actually end up right in the correct tempo into the 16ths. So the way that I would work on this, I often like to add slash marks to my part. So you're going to hear 2 clicks on the B flat, move into your 32nd note triplet passage, and then the big part of beat 2 is going to start on the 16th note. So ya, ya da da, 2 E and 3 E and same triplet 2 and 3 E and for those 2 measures. It's actually much more simple and straightforward than it looks on the page. Similar to the first movement, if you see a slash mark through a grace note, it means to play it as a quick grace note. If there's no slash mark through the tail of the grace note, that means to play it as a full 16th note. So we're going to run into this in two places. So if we come down to our fifth line in the music, right here in measure 20, that'll be the first place that you encounter it. There's a grace note E moving to a D at the beginning of the measure, and we're going to play this as straight 16ths. Not. And that's something that you just have to know about Mozart's music. It's not there in front of you, and so that's why you get to have these tips and tricks. One line later, you run into it once again, and you'll do the same thing, straight 16th notes rather than a quick grace note. Your trills that you run into here towards the end of the movement, they don't have to be super fast. You can be very expressive with them, especially the trill that you get to hold for 3/8 notes. You can start the trill a little bit slower, move into a faster trill before you finish the resolution pattern into measure 32. You might run into a little bit of breathing trouble here in the very last line. So every time that you get to have an 8th rest, I would go ahead and plan on an exhale and an inhale with your breathing. If you are feeling very tired by the end of this movement, you can even take some time in between the long quarter notes second from the end. That would be perfectly fine to breathe between the D and the F so that you have plenty of air left for that last high D. Now in Mozart's time, he wrote this for a wonderful oboist, Friedrich Ramm, and that particular oboist was known for his virtuosity and his technical ability. Mozart was really inspired by this musician, and which is why he wrote this oboe quartet. And it is certainly still a demanding piece today, and it would have been a real showstopper back in Mozart's day. I hope you feel confident as you work on the first and second movement from Mozart's oboe quartet. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Sullivan, and I'm wishing you happy practicing for your all-district material for the 2018-2019 school year.